All right, let me begin by thanking the committee members present and others who have joined us today. The principal focus of today's work is to hear the marginal abatement curve report. Well, I'm really looking forward to that. We also have some other business concerning just updates from task groups and a discussion of recommendations concerning budgets. And let me ask at the outset, are there other things that folks would like to recommend that we put on the agenda? Other adjustments to the agenda? Hearing none. Are there comments concerning the minutes of the last subcommittee meeting? Okay, thank you. So our major agenda item is to hear a report on the MAC curve research. And I know TJ, you've heard the report and are, I think, prepared to introduce this topic. So would you go ahead and do that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Reg. Before I do that, I do, well, first, thank you to Bram for taking the minutes last meeting, and recall that we have a new process where we need subcommittee members to kind of do a round robin and taking minutes here. And so I'm looking for a volunteer, subcommittee member volunteer to take minutes today. And it can't be Bram. Oh, I suppose it can be if everybody votes that Bram has to do it again.
I can take minutes.
Thank you, Joey. Okay, so with that piece of business out of the way, I just, I won't take much time here, but just wanted to introduce the topic of the marginal abatement cost curve. And, Jane can fill in where I leave off, but this really started almost 2 years ago when we started talking about using the LEAP modeling for the comprehensive energy plan modeling efforts, and then that translated into using the same model for both the energy plan and the climate action plan, which was really useful to have one set of numbers throughout that process, which gave us a couple of scenarios, a business as usual or a reference case, and then a mitigation pathway. We had some analysis on the net impacts of all of the measures in meeting our emissions targets. And there was in the contract and just generally a desire to understand the relative net cost of measures and how they stack up in terms of where we their net cost impact, whether it's positive or negative, towards meeting our emissions targets. And so this is the marginal abatement curve. So it started with, the LEAP modeling was done by Stockholm Environment Institute to start, and then Energy Futures Group, as part of the Cadmus team, has produced the Pathways report, which has proved to be extremely valuable and how we think about our emissions pathways. And this is kind of a next step or another piece of that, and builds off of that work to develop this marginal abatement cost curve. And so really happy to introduce again for this group, David Hill for Energy Futures Group, and Taylor Bennington from Stockholm Environment Institute, who have put together this memo and presentation for today. So I'm not sure which one of you are going to go first, but please take it away.
Great. Thank you, TJ. I'll start. And yeah, I want to thank everybody. I think know most of the people that are on the call, and it's nice to be back. to discuss these findings with all of you. As TJ said, EFG has been participating as part of a team led by Cadmus. Liz Hanson from Cadmus is on the phone with us today. And then my colleague Liz Bourget from Energy Futures Group. And then also assisting us in this, the development of this deliverable on the MAC curve has also been Shrikar Pradhan from Cadmus. So, but Taylor and I will be kind of doing most of the presentation this morning, and look forward to your questions and discussion. And Liz H and Liz B, feel free also to jump in if there are places that you would like to add comments. Let me share my screen and try to do it in the way that I don't get the presentation mode for. Let's see. Still haven't figured out the details of how to do this. So it's telling me now that I'm sharing. Am I sharing just the slide view, or is it coming up in the presentation view?
It is in presentation mode. It looks good to go.
Okay, great. Thank you. So yes, as TJ said, this, I think the climate action plan, the initial pathways report, the second version of the report that we delivered in February last year, these are all meant to be kind of, there's an ongoing need for analysis and continuing research to help support the state's efforts towards meeting the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. There have been a number of really positive steps. A lot of people on the call today participated in the EAN Energy Action Network Summit meeting last week, and some of the good steps that have been taken in terms of, say, financing for weatherization through on-bill financing through that was discussed, and other things have moved forward. There are other areas where actions that are in the pathways analysis are going to require further policy, regulatory, and initiative support. Certainly the Inflation Reduction Act and some of the funds that will be available through that are going to be important to help with that. One of our colleagues, one of the participants on today's call, took me aside at the meeting last week and said, yet another study and more analysis, but at the same time, hopefully what the analysis is doing, it's not just analysis for its own sake, but trying to help inform decision-making and inform the discussions among stakeholders about how Vermont can move forward to meet our targets. So what we'd like to do today, there are some people that I don't think have participated in all of the discussions before, so we'll just very briefly review the modeling and analysis that was conducted by our team to support the initial cap, the mitigation scenario, as TJ was saying, is represented in this slide, whereby the requirements, 5.1 million tons by 2030 and 1.7 by 2050 are met in the central mitigation pathway that's in the pathways analysis. So that scenario, across all of the different sectors, we can see that there are emissions reductions, and these are comprised of bundles, if you would, of activities that we characterize as measures within the analysis. But each measure represents hundreds, if not thousands, of individual actions and investments and those types of things. But we can still bundle them up and look. What we want to do today is look in a little bit more detail about, well, what are the measures and the actions, and what is their relative cost per ton of abatement that comes from each measure that in combination comprise the mitigation scenario. So we will spend some time talking about, and indeed we've spent collectively quite a lot of time talking about different approaches and methods for development of marginal abatement cost curves. There are a variety of ways that one can approach a marginal abatement cost curve. And so we will describe the method and the thinking that we've taken behind the MAC curves that we'll be presenting. And then we'll go over the MAC curve results with everybody and leave plenty of time for discussion and questions. We have probably maybe 20, 25 minutes of slides and plenty of time for discussion. So to briefly recap the team's modeling efforts, and as I'm talking, if there are questions that come up in the chat or pressing, questions of clarification or something, TJ, if you want to watch those, I don't have the chat window up, but if somebody can help me know if there's a question of clarification, we'll leave plenty of time for questions and discussions, but if they're clarifying questions as I'm going, please let me know. So the analysis is building upon the Pathways report, and this slide illustrates at a high level the economic benefits from the mitigation scenario compared to the baseline in terms of the savings that are above the 0 point, which is in between the blue and the orange lines here. This would be 0. And so the savings, the long-term savings, come from avoided fuel consumption and then also avoided social, economic, environmental damages. These are based on the social cost of carbon. I'll talk about that a little bit more detail as we go along. Additional investments required to change out heating systems and or to get more efficient equipment, to weatherize buildings, to support vehicle electrification, electric vehicles, new renewable electric generation and things. These additional costs show up below the 0 line here. And so when we take these two in combination, the net savings, the total net present value of the savings over the horizon period using a 2% discount rate is $6.4 billion. As TJ mentioned, we've worked closely with Taylor at SEI, Stockholm Environment Institute. They are the developers of the LEAP model. So we've been under license with them to use the LEAP model. And in turn, SEI worked with NESCOM on the development of the initial LEAP model that was used for the comprehensive energy plan. And then I think wisely the state determined that we've been using this modeling for the CEP. Now, as we develop the climate action plan, we want to be working with the same modeling framework, same structure, so that we can continue to refine and build upon the analyses rather than always having a different tool or a different starting point. We've talked about LEAP, its use and advantages, disadvantages, those types of things before, but a couple things to keep in mind. It's not predictive. These are scenarios that we define in terms of how the state can meet certain requirements and targets, but what LEAP is best. It's a strong accounting and comparison of alternative future pathways. The electric sector modeling that SEI and NESCOM does include some optimization it includes optimization in the electric sector, but it's not predictive. And then overall too, it's comparing and contrasting scenarios that we're defining as opposed to telling us this is the scenario that's that will happen or that is the best choice. So we use these to compare scenarios. It provides in fair amounts of detail and in many cases in more detail than we've been presenting to in presentations like this, the levels of activity by sector necessary to meet the requirements. And the modeling is based on technologies and the means for delivery, kind of the models and the methods for delivery, et cetera, things that are largely present today. The challenge is really scaling things up at the pace and at the depth of activity that's necessary to meet requirements. So it's not technologies that are not yet available or commercialized and available. So with that as just a very super high level review of the pathways analysis, the LEAP modeling that's gone into that, I'm going to turn a little bit more now specifically to the marginal abatement cost curves. We're going to spend a few slides here talking, and Taylor will join me as we do this, talking about our method and approach. And again, there are various different ways that marginal abatement cost curve can be constructed. And so we want to try to help make it clear about the method that we've used and why those were chosen. So some of the key questions, I think that, you know, if we keep this in mind, what we were, excuse me, you know, being driven by the questions that are helpful to answer rather than just by analyses. What is the mitigation potential and the net cost per ton of emissions reduction for the various groups of measures? As I said, there are many activities represented by each measure. But in the climate action plan's mitigation scenario, what is the relative mitigation potential and the net cost per ton of emissions reduction for those measures? And if we look at both at those with a medium and a long-term lens, what differences and or similarities do we see between those cost curves? And for the medium term, we defined that out through what are the actions and implementation through 2030. Long-term goes all the way out with implementation through 2050. And then how can the results of the marginal abatement cost curves be used to help inform the decision-making, policy and program design, and potentially also future analyses that will be conducted to support the CAP. This slide goes into a bit more depth and detail. Again, we are building off of the graphic on the right is from the Pathways 2.0 report, and it shows the net costs. The earlier slide that I showed the present value discounted costs across the full time period. This shows in each year the net costs and savings, with the savings on top being the avoided fuel and avoided environmental externalities, these top, the blue and the orange reddish bar on top there of zero. And then the costs by sector down below. And so this net cost curve, again, is kind of a foundation for the analysis that we've conducted and what we're presenting. In the process, though, we've also made some modifications. Taylor, do you want to talk about how we modified costs to reflect the, you know, modified costs as we were looking to create the marginal abatement cost curves?
Sure, I can sort of step in and talk a little more about how we did and what we did and how we did it, I guess. Yeah. First, it's it's a pleasure to see familiar faces and some new faces again, and it's been a pleasure to work with EFG and Cadmus on this work. So I am here sort of on behalf of SCI. We constructed the model largely, and then we adapted it and used it to generate some of these individualized measure-specific abatement costs that form the cost curve. So we made a couple of, well, first of all, we began with the model that was originally developed under the CEP and ported to the CAP process. And in that model, we had originally created sort of three different variants of a mitigation of a portfolio or of measures, or a mitigation scenario that was compliant with the GWSA requirements. And for the purposes of this abatement cost analysis exercise, we stuck with sort of what we were calling the central mitigation scenario, I think, or the CAP mitigation scenario in that analysis. We really just, we focused in and sort of drilled in on one of them. We began by making a couple of adjustments to the way that model incorporates investment costs for each of the different measures and the different actions, the different sort of very technical and engineering based measures that would be implemented sort of along the road to 80%. And that just comes from the original model having represented largely a lot of the investment costs were kind of they appeared as if they were, or they appeared in an annualized form, where we take, you know, the cost of buying a piece of equipment and we sort of spread that out over the number of years that equipment might last. And in some sense that sort of smooths out a net cost curve like the one that David has shown here on the right side of the slide. We took that and we kind of reformulated a lot of those annualized costs into sort of non-annualized investment costs, where instead of spreading out the purchase of a piece of equipment in a particular year, instead of spreading that over many years, we would represent the full cost in the year in which it was implemented. We're sort of moving from a smoother representation of investment or of costs in our model to one that I had sort of taken it to characterizing as a spiky representation, where you can, you know, in theory, you could sort of visually see the years in which various types of investment would be required. And that required some modeling changes, and we implemented those into the model. And then we wanted to take to take each one of those measures and calculate the cost of implementing that measure, sort of the full cost over the entire a period extending through 2050, as well as the GHG abatement that you would get from implementing that measure, and that is really and when we do that for each one of the measures and we represent that visually, that comprises a marginal abatement cost curve. So without getting into too many, we're going to try not to get too far into the weeds of the different ways that you can construct such curves, but I just will say that there are many different ways, and David alluded to this. There are many different ways of building these types of curves, and fundamentally they depend on different ways that you, when you represent the cost and the GHG impacts of a particular measure, you are necessarily confronted with having to answer the question relative to what, and it's that relative to what question that can be kind of methodologically thorny and challenging. And we've chosen a particular strategy which we think makes sense for this analysis, and that strategy is by examining the differences in the cost and the abatement that you would get of comparing the entire central mitigation scenario, the one that achieves 80% reductions below 1990 levels, comparing the cost of that full combination of measures with a scenario that is the full portfolio of measures minus one particular measure. So in other words, we examine the costs and the marginal costs and abatement of each measure in the context of all of the other measures being implemented. And that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind here. And then David has also been referring to what we've termed sort of as a medium term and a long term MAC curve, I guess. And what we mean by that here is, first of all, I'll start with the definition of the long term one. And that's where we calculate the full cost and abatement potential of each one of the measures in the way that I've just described, that is implemented in its entirety. So as it was represented in the original mitigation portfolio that is GWSA compliant. So ramping up implementation all the way through the year 2050, counting the GHG impacts of that and counting the costs as well. But also to respond to sort of some early input from both ANR and from PSD to focus or to develop some analysis for marginal abatement costs that focused just on the year or just on the next decade, so through the year 2030. We also developed sort of a separate variant that we've termed the medium term MAC curve. And that is where the individual measures are implemented along the same trajectory that they would be implemented in the full CAP scenario. But then we only implement them through 2030. And then we sort of, what we're really doing is looking at the abatement costs and the mitigation potential of those measures sort of as if they were ramped up through 2030, but then frozen at that point. And then for the next 20 years through the end of our analysis through 2050, we continue to count the costs and also the mitigation of any of the technology that was implemented prior to 2030, but not more than that. And so those two strategies are what give rise to this sort of what we're calling the medium term and the long term MAC curves. Those are the two regimes. Thanks for moving on. I was just gonna ask that. So and the way we've represented these costs and mitigation potentials is sort of in a canonical looking, MAC curve chart that for many of you who are familiar with or have seen these before will hopefully look familiar. It has this sort of characteristic stepped structure here, where each one of the colored rectangles in this chart represents the full implementation of one measure, and they're labeled using acronyms, which we'll introduce shortly. And the x-axis here is the total amount of abatement that you would get when you implement that measure, and so that means that the wider ones are more abating, and the y-axis is the cost per ton. So it's the sort of the average cost over the time frame that we're assessing through 2050 of what it would take in order to unlock that abatement. So kind of characteristic shape here, we've got some rectangles that are above the x-axis and some rectangles that are below the x-axis. So those are positive costs per ton, negative costs per ton respectively. And the negative cost per ton, really, I mean, that's just what that means is it is a savings. And again, relative to, and this is always the challenging question to answer in this type of analysis, but relative to a portfolio with all other measures except the one being represented as in the particular rectangle. So just again, to really emphasize that with using an example, if you imagine one of these colored rectangles here to represent, say, the mitigation measure, which we've described as, heat pump hot water heaters, for example. The way that's represented in this curve here is that the cost per ton and the abatement of that measure is, assumes that you have every other measure implemented in the CAP mitigation portfolio, and then you introduce this additional measure of heat pump hot water heaters, and you measure the difference in how much abatement you get and what the cost of doing that would be. David's also represented that I should just mention that there's a dashed line through the middle here, which is sort of just for context, and that's like an average social cost of carbon of $146 per ton. We know that the social cost of carbon is follows an increasing trajectory into the future. This is sort of an average representation of that, but it's just really taken sort of for context so that you can see, for example, how much abatement could be unlocked beneath that cost. I guess we can go to the next slide. Unless
Taylor, I think there's a question from Brian and our staff here.
Sure.
Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for entertaining me. So Taylor, I think I just want to ask some clarifying questions for the new audience regarding this approach. So as you described, the approach compares the CAP mitigation scenario, which achieves the GWSA targets in all years, to this CAP mitigation scenario minus measure X, each of the measures, right? And that scenario does not achieve the reductions, the GWSA reductions, right? Because you're taking out something that's required. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. And that's how you're able to calculate what the emissions benefit is for each one. That's the width of the curves. It's the difference between emissions in the cap mitigation scenario versus this alternative.
That's right.
So I think that's important. And then the second part of it is for measures that have negative costs or savings, like you said, that means that the cap mitigation scenario minus X actually costs more than the cap mitigation scenario, even though it results in higher emissions.
Right. Also right.
So that's a little counterintuitive, but I think that's an important concept for people to understand. And the reason for that is because it's a net cost. And when you do something like, I know you haven't gone through this, but clean cooking, you incur savings over time from avoided purchase of the fuels that would otherwise be used if you weren't implementing that clean cooking measure, for example.
That's right. And that's a good point to raise, that when I'm talking about costs and net costs here, I am speaking kind of in a general sense about all types of costs that would be incurred or saved from sort of a societal perspective from introducing a particular measure. So it includes the outlay, the purchase of say a piece of equipment or something and maintaining that, but it also includes the expenditure on fuel or the additional or changes to costs to produce electricity, for example. And then when you have either a positive or negative looking bar, depending on how that compares with the full CAP scenario.
And let me add here too, it's been mentioned, but these are social costs. This is not an individual customer's perspective. Say, for instance, it's not a rate and bill impact. It's not like customer financial perspectives. These are, moving a little bit onto this slide here, so we keep going. The full portfolio of measures in the initial cap, as I presented at the beginning, they're highly cost effective. As a group, these provide significant economic benefits. What we don't, the MAC curve, the improper use perhaps of the MAC curve, there are several possibilities. One would be to say, well, let's only do the ones that provide net savings, and more expensive measures, let's not do those. That risks not meeting the requirements. The emissions reductions from all of these are part of the cap scenario and are required to meet the requirements of the GWSA. Higher cost measures, may require incentives and support, and lower cost measures shouldn't be assumed because they provide net savings to be things that will happen without any policy intervention or potential support. In fact, they're not in the baseline being these are the things that we assume will be happening kind of on their own, or that there's already support in place for. So it shouldn't be assumed that the lower cost measures happen without additional support. I'll move us on now to more explicitly. We'll look at the results of both.
Well, can we?
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. There's a couple more questions.
Two other
that
questions.
clarifying. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, Joe. I was going to jump in and get there.
Yeah.
Joey,
Thank
why don't
you.
you go ahead?
Well, Rich had his hand up first, although my question was just going to be to ask you, Taylor, maybe David, to do your best to break down what you're talking in the simplest of terms. Like, what is this? I mean, this is a lot to process, and it's very hard to read, like what those measures are. And just like, and then you noted a difference in terms of the analysis window. So to what you're saying here. So can you just take another stab at summarizing this like you're talking to my dad, who never gets this stuff, no matter how much I talk to him about it?
Thank you, Joey. It's it potentially is complicated, and so we will try to keep it to avoid kind of the complications. One of the things, a fundamental thing about the approach that we took, and this is something that we discussed, you know, with A&R and the Public Service Department on several occasions before we did this. So it's not just, oh, we decided this was the best approach, but rather than compare measures to a non-compliant baseline and look at the cost and the emissions reductions for each one, we kind of, this cost curve is based on comparisons to, a fundamental assumption here is that Vermont is taking steps to meet the requirements for the Global Warming Solutions Act. And these individual measures, the wider, whoops. And we will get to some that are larger and also tabular results so that we can describe these in more detail. I recognize these are meant just to be graphically representational. The wider the bar, the more emissions reductions associated with that measure. Narrower the bar, the fewer emissions reductions. The lower the bar, or you know, on the vertical axis, items that are below zero net savings, net negative costs, which are savings, and then the higher ones are more expensive. So that's how you can simplify this, is wide is better and below the x-axis is better.
That's helpful. Can you put a fine, thank you for that. Good job. My dad would be proud and he would potentially get it.
Thank you.
In terms of the difference in terms of what you calculated, can you say again the difference in, you're analyzing up to 2030 and then freezing?
We will.
You'll get back to that?
Yeah, let's,
Okay.
if we can. Yep.
And Rich, I think you had a
I have a straightforward question. I think you're going to answer Joey's question later, I hope, you know, in the way you go through it. But you mentioned that you do count in the benefits the social cost of carbon avoided, correct? That's certainly in your very first graph. Is it also represented in this chart?
In this chart, the social cost of carbon is represented by the dotted line. It is not part of the net costs and benefits that represent the individual blocks.
Okay. And similarly, at one point you talked about sort of net societal benefits, but there are other, for example, health benefits,
yes,
that are not included in the orange squares here, for example.
Yes, and so for that reason, we shy away from using the term these bars represent cost effectiveness, because cost effectiveness needs to consider a broader range of elements. This represents the relative cost per ton of abatement. That's a component of cost effectiveness, but it's not by itself, doesn't by itself define cost effectiveness.
Okay, so in public policy terms, there are potentially significant benefits associated with these measures that are not represented in the size of the squares or rectangles that are on this chart.
The MAC is not yes, it's not a cost effectiveness curve. It shouldn't, yeah.
Okay. I mean, that's important for public policy terms to realize there are other benefits out there.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay. So the medium term marginal abatement table, and here's where we can, I'll review the particulars of what we said. Joey and Taylor, you can take a crack at the simplified version of it, but the name of the measure, basically the scenario, and there are different scenarios then that include and exclude each measure individually, excuse me, as we go through. But these are the acronyms that are used in the chart, and this is a variable column width chart. It's a little bit, they're interesting to create such a chart. But what I've done on these two is I've grouped similar, so that electrification, building electrification is clean cooking, heat pump water heaters and heat pumps. The transportation measures are sustainable aviation fuel, biodiesel B20 used in transportation, the phase out of internal combustion engines, ethanol 15 and vehicle miles reduced. The renewable fuels are renewable gas in industry, renewable gas in buildings, which is also termed biogas in the scenarios. But so these are grouped this way. And then I've also, in this table, I've grouped, these are the measures that have the net negative costs or savings in the medium term chart. These are the ones with a cost between 0 and the social cost of carbon. And then these are the ones that are greater than the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon we used was based on it's the levelized cost based on the table that was adopted by the Climate Council last year. That was based on research that had been done for the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, et cetera. Just recently in September, at the beginning of September, there is an update from Resources to the Future for the new federal update to the social cost of carbon, which would be higher, which would have an average cost, I think, of about $185. So the levelized cost based on the table that was adopted by the Climate Council from 2020 to 2050 is $146. So that's the reference line that we've included in this. Taylor, do you want to take a crack at the simplified medium term description for Joey's dad?
Yeah, I will try. Certainly, like I think it's a really good question to ask. Because there's a couple of I think there are a couple of separate things which we could explain to our or try that our parents might have questions about it with this sort of methodology. For example, just the process by which we calculated the height and width of these bars and what the difference between the medium and the long-term measures are. I guess what I'll say, I'll try to answer it as broadly as possible. That the height and width of these bars, in other words, what they get for us, how much abatement, and then the average cost of that abatement, it's measured in the long-term curve. It's measured from the perspective of us in the year 2050, and Vermont has met all of its Global Warming Solutions Act requirements. And if we were to look back and say, what were the steps that got us here, and how much did each one of those get us, and what did each one of those cost? That's the interpretation of these bars. It's like looking back in a world in which we meet those requirements. What were the individual ingredients in getting them? That's kind of a clearer maybe interpretation of what we've been calling the long-term curve. The medium-term curve is similar. It's imagining, it's sort of looking back and saying, what would be the costs and the cost per ton if we were to be advancing towards meeting the GWSA targets, but then we stopped in 2030. And so in some sense, it's kind of, it's a shorter term assessment of the first steps that we would need to take in order to achieve those requirements, but framed in a way that we are still making an attempt to evaluate sort of the longer term impacts of all of the actions that we have implemented before the year 2030. So and I've given quite a bit of thinking to the interpretation of this medium-term variant here and the long-term variant, because it's not obvious. And I think that the best sort of answer that I can come up with is that, you know, fundamentally the long-term curve, which David will show you shortly, that is a more holistic representation of all of the ingredients that it takes, or that it could take in a particular scenario that we developed, for meeting the GWSA requirements. And when we compare that to the medium-term curve, I think that shows us the differences in, like, or what we would miss if we were only to think short-term about this problem. So I think I personally have challenges sometimes interpreting standalone, the medium-term MAC curve. But I do think that relative to the longer term one, it shows us kind of what we miss if we think shorter term about the problem.
Let me offer a few things too, and then I'll go through we'll go through the rest of the slides here.
I also see some hands, David.
Yeah, we want to leave time for questions. So these represent, and I will also recommend, you know, there are a few commonalities between the two. The appearance of electrification as being net savings in all of them, the importance of transportation with the phase out of internal combustion engines, the important role of non-energy measures in the long term. One thing you don't see in the medium term, I think that's important to point out, is that the renewable energy activities, the expansion, say, of the renewable energy standard occurs after 2030. And so up to 2030, it doesn't really make that, it doesn't have a significant impact. And so it's not in the medium term curve, but when we look at the long-term curve, we do see that that comes in. So with everybody's, I think let me go through these let me go through a couple slides here really quickly, and then we'll open it up if that works. Is that okay, TJ? Just for timing?
Yeah, unless it was a clarifying question that you had, Bram.
Yeah. So just on this 2030,
Yeah.
you know, we do all the work we're planning to do to 2030, and then we stop. And does this, so some of that work, like we put in a heat pump water heater in 2025 or whenever we do. So we've got a cost in 2025 of buying the thing, and then we've got an operating cost for a couple of years, and we have a savings because we're not buying gas or whatever we were using to heat our water. Does this incorporate the costs and benefits that one gets beyond 2030?
Yes.
That, okay.
So it does. It includes out through the 2050. It's
so this is
it's the further implementation of
yeah,
that same measure that stops. Basically.
got it. So this is sort of, it includes all the kind of upfront capital expenses to do the thing through 2030, but then also includes the operating savings and benefits through 2050.
As well as the emissions reductions through 2050.
Thank you.
This is a long-term curve, again, structured with the names, the acronyms, the grouping of the acronyms by color, you know, grouping of the measures into categories by color, and then the bands of those that are less, have savings, negative costs, costs that fall between 0 and the 146, and then costs that are higher than that. And here is the chart for that. And what we see is relatively the width of the bars are somewhat similar, you know, are relatively similar with the and some of the structure of the curve. There are a lot of similarities. The electrification here showing up, the transportation phase out of the internal combustion engines, non-energy remaining important, renewable energy, expansion of the renewable energy standard up to 100% playing an important role here. In both curves, you know, more than 90% of the emissions reductions are below this $146 per ton of the social cost of carbon. This doesn't capture all of the benefits, as Rich was saying. It's not strictly a cost effectiveness curve, but it's important to note that most of the emissions reductions in both the long-term and medium-term perspective are less expensive. One of the things that happens is a little counterintuitive is out in this total thing. As your grid gets cleaner, as renewable fuels come online and everything, the cost for the building shell, you know, which was more on this end, by the long term switches out over. If you knew already that all building shell, the efficiency, the impacts of efficiency are smaller and become more expensive. There's intuitively it makes sense. It's one of the reasons why, in some ways, the short-term perspective too, when we think about this, building shell efficiency improvements and everything will help to interactively reduces the need for investments in these others. But there are a couple things that switch significantly from one side to the other in terms of their overall cost for abatement between the medium and the long-term curves.
Can I just add something very, very quickly to that? Because I think sometimes it's misleading to think of, you know, certain measures being co-implemented with other measures as increasing the cost. It's not necessarily that the costs of efficiency get higher. It's that the abatement gets lower if there are other actions that have been co-implemented. So when you divide the same cost by a smaller abatement, you get that can sort of play havoc with your average cost per ton, which is what we're representing here on the curve.
Yeah, that's a good point. Go through these quickly. So as I said, you know, more than 90% of the emissions reductions in medium and long term have less than the social cost of carbon. Each measure in these groups, it's important to recognize that this, you know, we're talking about tens of thousands of households and heat pumps and everything else. It's not just an individual measure. These are bundles necessarily for the modeling. The measures are beyond what's baseline, and therefore the measures are going to require generally policy and programmatic support. We just talked about some of these. This is the cost effectiveness point, Rich, that you were asking about earlier. And these analyses we think can help to provide both inputs for further analysis, information to help with policy discussions, and may also, you know, help to define the need for further analyses, you know, related, say, to particulars about mixes or emissions profiles for the renewable fuels that are incorporated and things like that. So with that, we appreciate everybody's time and the good questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Well, I'll keep the screen up in case people want to reference back to something. I can scroll back.
So appreciate Bram asking that question, because I wanted to make the same clarification and then want to extend it to 2050. And so the values in 2050, kind of the benefits stop at 2050. It's more of a snapshot in 2050, right? So the way I interpret that is it's kind of it's artificially inflating the costs in 2050 of measures that are implemented then, because you're not if you're looking at lifetime costs of a measure. And so it's a little different analysis than what in 2030 you're saying, okay, the measures are implemented up till 2030, but the benefits, you know, and costs, if there's costs, but you know, like a weatherization measure, the benefits will continue for 20 years after 2030. And so I just wanted to articulate that so that folks didn't necessarily compare those kind of 2030 and 2050 in that way.
Yeah, and that's correct, TJ. Thank you. The if you would, the end effects for all of the measures in the long term are kind of cut off at 2050, whereas in the medium term, there's a 20-year period that will benefit measures that have the longer term impacts, longer measure lives.
Right. And why is that? Is it that we didn't think we had the forecasts for those benefits that accrue?
Well, I think, I mean, it would require then basically having the time, the whole pathways analysis horizon go out to 2070.
So that's a clarification. I didn't realize, did the pathways analysis in the economic impact not include benefits after 2050? I thought it did.
No, the end effect, it's the analysis horizon is through 2050. And so then all elements have, and one of the reasons, I think Taylor, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the approaches that says, one of the things that Taylor's more smooth or less spiky approach is helpful when to deal with end effects, because it's smoothing the costs.
Yeah, I just want
Sorry.
to restate that. Sorry, so I feel like maybe I'm the only one, but as involved as I was in that analysis, I guess I didn't realize that the economic impact of the pathways report does not include kind of the future benefits after 2050. I think that's really important for everybody to understand, because internalizing it right now, it seems like that makes the estimate of net impacts, economic impacts that was presented in the pathways report seem like a conservative estimate.
Conservative.
Like there's all of these carry-on benefits going forward. So
Yep.
I know that's not necessarily marginal abatement cost curve, but I wanted to carry that thought out.
Yep.
I don't know whose hand was up first, Graham or Rich.
It doesn't matter. I think I was first, but okay. So to understand, I need to understand better why building shell improvements, which in the short-term curve, medium-term curve, looked very beneficial. In the long-term curve, look like they're super expensive per ton avoided. And I get it that you're excluding the end effects. I mean, that there's that benefits to 2070 aren't included, but still most of the building shell improvements would have occurred before the year 2050, and therefore they would have already been delivering savings. Maybe you could help me out if the argument is,
I think,
okay.
I think, Rich, I looked at this too and was curious. My sense, and open to others thinking on this, is that the building shell, the weatherization at scale continues apace throughout the horizon. So there continue to be building shell measures implemented throughout the period, because partially because of the, if we look holistically at the benefits and costs, and the other impacts that come from weatherization in terms of affordability and health and safety and all of these things and equity issues, the weatherization continues to be implemented as it goes, as we move out, because it's a relatively longer lived measure life. And because the end effect costs in the long term get cut off, I think that probably for building shells has more of an impact. The reduction, the cumulative abatement reduction is relatively the same, but I think that the costs for the non-annualized costs for the weatherization get counted, but the longer term benefits don't get counted. And so it suffers in shifting from the medium term to the long term perspective using these methods. it goes from being cost effective to less cost effective.
And I guess I needed an understanding of the comparison between heat pumps and advanced wood heat in across the two scenarios. They both show up as highly beneficial or have cost savings in the medium term. But in the longer term scenario, heat pumps are on the left-hand side of the chart and
Yeah.
advanced wood heat goes to the right-hand side of the chart.
Yeah.
I don't know why they don't have similar effects.
A lot of this, I think it has to do with the other measures that would be implemented like after 2030. So going back to like the weatherization or other sort of efficiency measures. If you are talking about weatherizing buildings in a future in which no more heat pumps, for example, are introduced after 2030, and in a future in which no more green electricity on the grid is introduced after 2030, or well, actually after the sort of current RPS, which as it is currently described, then weatherization continues to have like a significant impact, right? Because there's still lots of relatively a fair bit of dirty electricity that's being used in some heat pumps, but not a lot. But there's still lots of oil and propane and gas heating, etc. And so that means that weatherization as a measure has a lot of greenhouse gas abatement impact. But if you measure that in a future in which the sort of full implementation, GWSA compliant implementation of heat pumps and of renewable electricity is carried out, then weatherization as a measure, I mean, you have to pay to weatherize the houses, but that has relatively less impact because the fuels that are being used to heat those houses are cleaner. So, and that, that ends up creating kind of a pretty wild swing in like the average cost per ton for that particular measure.
All right, well, we can have this, I don't want to monopolize this part of the conversation, but it looks like heat pumps stay on the left-hand side of the chart.
Yeah.
In both short-term and long-term, but advanced wood heat shifts from the very left to the very right. And I don't understand the reason why one form of heating would shift so radically and the other one doesn't.
Right. And I think it's a good question. Yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about it separately.
Yeah.
Bram?
Just to follow up on TJ's point, the long-term analysis incorporates the costs and the benefits incurred in the period now to 2050, and none of the costs or benefits beyond that. But through 2050, I think the entire project is net positive by $6 billion or something, as I recall the numbers. And I think just to amplify TJ's point, that it feels that is probably conservative because in the period 2050 to 2070, with all of this in place, as we said about the 2030 date, you could stop putting in new stuff at 2050 and you would still continue to accrue benefits of all the infrastructure you've built and the transitions you've made. So, I mean, we've already got a highly net positive project, and it's even more net positive than the numbers show.
And that's a good point, Bram, and I think well stated. And the social cost of carbon updates are likely to increase, which will only increase the estimated net benefits as well. And again, all this is from the social cost perspective. Things like the thermal analysis that's going to come out, further future analysis of individual customer perspectives or the business impacts for different businesses, et cetera, those are different in terms of, what measures are, how are things cost effective, what incentives are available through federal assistance or through, other forms, what are the costs and the rate and bill impacts from the individual customer perspective. I think many of these measures, again, can be made cost effective from the customer's perspective as well. But at the social level, you're right. I think there are reasons why this is relatively conservative and still very, very positive.
Thank you, David. I think we need to move on. Stella, let's take your question.
Yeah.
And then go to public comment.
Earlier you mentioned bundles, as in like the estimates are not, they don't estimate individual like customer costs. I was wondering what that scale of estimates is, like if it's to the scale of Vermont, or smaller or larger. I guess specifically like the benefits.
I'm not sure I understand the question, Stella. It's
Like the implementation. So what scale of implementation would be needed for those benefits?
The scale of the implementation of the measures in the written report is referenced, and then also in the pathways analysis. So, say for building shell improvements, this is 120,000 weatherizations by 2030.
Okay.
And with all the different measures, there are the numbers of heat pumps, et cetera. So yes, the scales, as I said, are often it's the tens of thousands that we're talking about of individual actions and purchasing decisions, et cetera.
And Stella, to add to that, you asked about Vermont scale. I think these are costs to Vermont and benefits to Vermont.
Okay, thank you.
Except for the social cost of carbon when it's included, is a general global benefit.
Yeah.
But the MAC curve doesn't actually include that in the rectangles.
Right. It's just as a reference.
Yeah. So thanks. Sorry, we only had
No, that's fine.
an hour to talk about this. We could obviously spend all day.
Yeah. So once again, well, thank you, everybody. And yeah, if there are follow-ups, we can answer questions. This is kind of for the Cadmus team, Cadmus EFG and SEI working with us on this component. This is kind of the final deliverable that we have under the contract to support the climate action plan. But it's we've enjoyed and benefited from working with everybody and having a committee process like this where we can really get lots of comments and feedback, as well as try to work with folks while we're developing the analyses. It's very useful. So thank you.
Thanks.
Echo what David says. Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and thanks for creating a bit of space and time for us to go into some of the intricacies here. So
yeah,
happy to answer more questions as they come up.
Thanks very much, guys. Time for public comment, questions from other people. All right, I don't see any hands. So we should move on to our next topic. We want to do task group updates and budgeting priorities. And we've been doing that by task group. I don't know if people are prepared to talk about the budgeting priorities today, but let's see, working across the task groups.
Yeah, Rich, if I could just
Yeah.
tee it up a little bit more, if you don't mind.
Please.
And just going back to the last meeting and the council meeting prior, the next council, has teed up the opportunity for subcommittees to make recommendations to the council, which in turn could make recommendations to the administration for inclusion of funding in its budget proposal. And the deadline for that is the October council meeting that ends, soon after that, the council would need to submit something to the administration. And so the process has been, as a reminder, that the cross-sector mitigation committee has gone to ask the task groups to come up with budget recommendations. And at our last meeting, just to refresh everybody's memory, I think outreach was a consistent theme from all of the task groups, but recognizing that it was a theme from all the task groups. The Just Transitions Committee has recommended outreach, that we, as a cross-sector mitigation committee, had recommended that the steering committee take up that issue to best recommend to the council how to move forward with a recommendation for to the administration on outreach. Hopefully that was clear. That so I think we probably don't need to talk about that more on outreach right here, unless there are specifics that we want to bring up on what we think there needs to be outreach for. I think the thermal task group has said we need outreach for thermal policy development. The transportation task group has in its recommendations an outreach ask. And so so I wanted to kind of put that one on the side, and then because there's no folks from Liz and Adam aren't here, but I'll just say for the biomass committee, my understanding is from our last cross-sector meeting that they said it's too early to make any further recommendations for funding, and so they don't have any recommendations. Anybody can correct me if I'm wrong there. Wanted to tee this up again just to see if there were other more specific recommendations and give an opportunity to say, okay, those need to get in place and with a dollar amount before the next council meeting if there's specific dollar recommendations for funding. I think I broke the record for the amount of times I said the word recommendation in a 2-minute time period there, but hopefully that better articulates what this segment of today's meeting is about, and maybe we can just open it up for discussion from any of the task groups.
Thanks, Keith. Jane?
Yeah, that was all great. Thank you for that. TJ, I just wanted to mention that I did drop in the chat, and Marion just followed up, and I was going to speak to what Marion put in the chat, but the comments up above with the direct guidance that came out of the council at the last meeting for how the budget recommendations should be bucketed. And then, of course, the deadline is next Friday, the 7th, so that we were able to follow them up to the council for a week of review. If you put forward recommendations, there is further guidance that I'll drop in the chat around prioritization too, that the council asked for, so that they can see how your recommendations rank out for all of you. And the other main comment for why I had raised my hand was just a reminder that when A&R put forward our memo and then a follow-up memo about the budget for the Climate Action Office, there is $400,000 in that proposed one-time funding for the buildings and thermal analysis work. So I just wanted to remind you that A&R is asking for $400,000 to further advance the buildings and thermal conversation. Some of that is to repay the money that we are putting out for the analysis that we're doing, but those additional funds are also going towards looking at sort of data needs and emissions monitoring, as well as some outreach and engagement.
Jane, thanks very much for the note about thermal. and it, we should note that the RFP for the thermal research has been posted. Is that right, on Friday? And I guess I just want to take a moment to both thank the administration for doing that, and also to note for the record some concerns about it. This committee asked for the study, and we're glad to see that it's going forward. But we have two concerns about it, and I hope that they can be dealt with in the course of the study going forward. First, we hope that consultants won't be reinventing the wheel and going back over a huge list of possible policy responses that have been pretty well studied in Vermont and pretty well resolved. And I would encourage whoever is guiding the study, and I hope we will be part of the guidance with the consultants that are selected, to focus attention on the clean heat standard and other policy options that haven't already been studied and more or less put to the side. And the second is that it has to do with timing. I'm speaking for myself here, not for the committee, but I'm concerned that we are in some danger of losing another legislative session and falling another year behind on addressing the mandate that's included in the GWSA, and would urge the study to go forward in a way that gives some information to the legislature in time for the legislature to assess in what direction they might want to go. So just wanted to kind of plant a flag on those two issues now before the consultants are brought on board. And Jane, thanks for all your efforts on this. TJ, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I do have some comment on that, actually, on what you just said, but I want to hold that so that we can actually get through the talking about the budgeting first. And I guess it is related to what Jane, you mentioned, that there's still funding. There's funding in the A&R ask to the administration for more technical analysis, more repayment of funds, and some outreach. And can you shed any more light on what the some outreach is? Because I think there's different levels that, if this group said, oh, well, A&R is doing it, but you only meant like $25,000, that may be different than what this group is thinking for outreach there.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. So we asked for an additional $200,000 towards the building. We have $200,000 committed in our current budget to fund the analysis that is now posted in the RFP that I put in there on the chat. And so we asked for $400,000 to reimburse the $200,000 that we sort of, robbed Peter to pay Paul with that money, and we'll reimburse that. To use, that was really funding that had been set aside for the measuring and assessing progress tool development. And since we've been slow to move that forward, could use that funding now and sort of backfill it. The additional $200,000 is not defined, and we will work with the Buildings and Thermal Task Group, in collaboration to think about how we advance those funds. Look at the funds like all of a sudden out. We will work with all of you, but the priorities, the way we described them, were largely around data, so fuel data to inform any policy that would come forward, if the clean heat standard moves forward sooner rather than later, or anything. Good data is going to be imperative to understanding how to advance that. And then we also made the case around communication and outreach and engagement, which was obviously part of the clean heat standard as well, and we could help to advance sooner rather than later. But we'll work with all of you, and I don't imagine it to be like a full-fledged engage, it's hard for me to picture exactly how that will move forward and what proportion will be needed for each section.
So thank you for that, Jane. And so what I want to suggest here for this group is to consider whether this group wants to recommend to A, steering committee, B, full council, something along the lines of more outreach for the thermal sector, or in support or in addition to whatever A&R is allocating in its funding request. And so when I think about, we've been thinking about this on the electric side for the effort that the department is undertaking to consider our electricity programs, and something like deliberative polling is like $250,000, right? It's expensive. And so I just want to keep that in mind. If that's the type of outreach and type of effort that this committee wants to put forth, then maybe there needs to be something, that we come up with in the next week that says this is what we want. And I think that transportation sector might also want that.
Thanks, TJ. Joey?
Yeah, so I would love to explore that further with all of you. I'm sort of struggling a little bit. And Jane, can you remind us, or anyone, or remind me anyway, like what has the A&R's annual budget been for this entire endeavor annually? I'm sort of struggling
I'll
with
put the memo in the chat, Joe, so you can look at because it's varied over the last few years.
Right, but I'm just sort of struggling with the sort of scale of like what is there because there's a lot of needs. So in terms of prioritizing things, I get that we cannot do everything, but I think it would be helpful to understand the scale of what a reasonable ask from a variety of different needing subcommittees would be.
Yeah, so I in the council conversation, there is a more than $240 million general fund surplus that will be spread out across state agencies, state government. And so the guidance, again, was really to be thinking about accessing some of those one-time funds, what was the necessary or in-house available administrative capacity to put whatever amount you ask for on the ground within 1 to 2 years, because 1 year, so there is millions of dollars, not for A&R, but to really be thinking about where there is administrative capacity, whether it be in the climate office, whether it be in the PSD, the ag agency, other places to advance strategies or actions from the plan that can be done in 1 to 2 years. And our current budget in the climate office is $1.1 million of base funding, but we're asking for more one-time funding this year for climate initiatives. Other people are asking for, so I expect A&R to get some additional capacity through one-time funding this year, as will other agencies. Are
there thoughts about TJ's observation on deliberative polling? TJ, the department is thinking about doing deliberative polling for the electricity sector. Is that correct?
Well, that's one of we're considering that as an option. I wouldn't, yes, so yes, that is correct. I don't know that we will have the funding or go down that path, but it was one of the areas we heard feedback on that would be useful. And
right. Well, I would just, based on my exposure to deliberative polling, I would think that it would be a useful process of engagement to go through for thermal. So I wonder whether it's possible to consider doing something that would be engage people on both topics, or whether they would have to be constructed separately. But ideally, we would get some efficiencies out of engaging people together on thermal and electricity, because they're so interconnected.
That would be great. I think that would be better to not come out of the department's budget also, but that's neither here nor there.
Jane?
But I was just going to say, I mean, I know the transportation task group, and maybe Joey will speak to this too, or Andrea, others, but we've talked about it. I think just broadly, like deliberative polling is an interesting next step to consider in the space of policy design, and just sort of reaching out to Vermonters in a way, very intentional around emissions reduction strategies and policy and all of that. And it's not something that I've seen. It's not in an A&R budget proposal right now, and it's not specifically listed anywhere else. So it'd be interesting.
Megan?
Yeah, I'll just note in response to that mention from Jane that the Science and Data Subcommittee is also considering putting in their budget or funding of efforts related to exploring and identifying how to communicate with the public better about the data that we're using to make decisions, and just a better approach to delivering and explaining the data that we're using to inform our process. So that is something that we're discussing. We haven't finalized anything, but I just wanted to mention that that's kind of churning in our Science and Data Subcommittee.
Thanks, Megan. So it's just to move this conversation along, wonder whether we could ask each of the three task groups, particularly, well, thermal, electricity, and transportation, to put their heads together with respect to a request for support for deliberative polling. I mean, we sort of generically said outreach last time around. We didn't really specify deliberative polling particularly. And wondering whether we have support for that.
Yeah, I suggested deliberative polling as a potential, just to highlight that costs of outreach that folks may be thinking of here might be more than A&R. I would, I think the Just Transitions Committee is doing a lot of good work on, thinking of the best ways to do outreach. And, Kashka isn't here today. Often she is, but I don't know if the cross-sector mitigation committee is in position to be so specific as to say what kind of outreach, as opposed to saying, that we're supportive of outreach, that the steering committee should do it. We think that there's likely to be more than what A&R is asking for in its budget, if that's true. And then kind of put that request in that manner, and supportive of the Just Transitions Committee kind of actually deciding what the right kind of outreach is.
Thanks, TJ. So why don't we leave it that task groups can speak to the steering committee about, to elaborate a bit more on the manner of outreach that we think might be considered and recommended by the steering committee to the council. And it looks like we don't have enough of the task group folks here today to nail it. But that we did decide, as you pointed out, to leave it to the steering committee to recommend to the council. So we can communicate separately to the steering committee. Joey, you have a hand?
Yeah, I mean, in general, I like the idea of deliberative polling. And I don't have enough familiarity with it to think about its different applications, but I think in general, it'd be great to get a pulse of the people. I'd love to work in collaboration with Just Transitions. I also think that it could be helpful to gauge different strategies when we have more clear questions to ask people. So I guess I would just support what you're either further work in a concrete conversation at the task group level to lift up to cross-sector or to the steering committee, but I very much would like us to explore that route to figure out, how do we do better public engagement, but in service of more concrete steps that we need to take. So we're having meeting as a task group on Monday. We could do some more work there. I'm wondering about sort of the timing of putting all this together by October 7th. That's still an open question to me. And secondly, Rich, you've raised this point in the past, and I think that in my mind, there's a need for it. The role that Jane has played and Marion have played, and just generally supporting the council. It feels like someone or someone's to be a liaison to the Climate Council and to the climate, as working with the Climate Council and to the Climate Office. It feels like there's just more potential capacity there. If that's not, Jane and Marion, who've been doing incredible work, sort of weaving a more connective tissue to all this work. So I'm saying two things: yes to deliver to polling, asking a question about process, and putting out there that it feels to me that there's probably going to be a need to invest in just the council capacity itself, independent of the Climate Office. But that's my feeling. Others may not share it.
Thank you. We have said this before, and I will repeat it to the steering committee, that the council needs support, direct support. And Jane has done a wonderful job of showing us how valuable that can be. And as I said last time, it's a compliment to Jane that she's proven the value of the kind of support that she's given. And the fact that we want that kind of support to continue is, I think, an opinion widely shared. TJ, I'd like to pause for a moment because we're past our time for asking for public comment. So I want to see whether there are public comments to be heard at this point. And then we can wrap up with, I think, what will be short reports from the task groups. And Jane, thanks for the shout out to Marion.
So if I could just summarize that last discussion, though, so it sounds like to the steering committee, the report back is direct support and outreach, and that we can make that recommendation, but we'd like the steering committee and Just Transitions Committee to direct that outreach. And I think it sounds like potentially more funding than what ANR has already is already like supporting that funding, but more funding than ANR may be proposing. And then the third thing is that as co-chairs, Rich and I have a report to time slot to the full council, and we can also communicate that in terms of the budgeting priorities there as well. Just wanted to close the loop on that, and I'm not sure if I'm missing anything. The one thing that comes to mind is the specific recommendations of the transportation work group that the full council took up last meeting. Are there specific funding beyond outreach for those things?
Thanks, TJ. I think you wrapped it up well. The only thing I would add is that we will encourage the steering committee to leave open the possibility both in budgetary terms and in process terms, for new forms of outreach that could include deliberative polling, designed, in a way to deepen input that we get from the public. Joey?
And just in reference to what TJ's last point in terms of the transportation, the concrete things coming out of the transportation task group. I mean, I'm going to drop this into the chat. You can see the memo we put forward. It does highlight outreach, which we've been discussing, which is really important, and agree we should do it in collaboration with Just Transitions. Talks about continuing to elevate and advance other strategies. And the only thing I'd really pull out that may need some funding support, and I don't want to put Megan or anyone on the spot, but is sort of this, our recognition of the need to create a more, a stronger greenhouse gas emissions reporting program, and at a more granular level. And I don't know the cost of that would be, but it is a concrete, could be one-time investment that seems like a fundamental foundation for the work we need to do in the transportation space. But we haven't circled around that with more clarity or concrete budgetary requests. So I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in there, but that's one thing I would point out.
Thanks, Joey. Should we move on to task group reports?
I do want to just, I'm sorry, Rich, but I do want to move on, but just for the record, I feel like we should note that I don't think we have a quorum anymore.
Right.
And, but I think any of that, all of that discussion was confirming a previous discussion. So I don't think we crossed any lines there of making decisions that, any decisions without a quorum. But I just point that out for everybody. And I think going forward, we just have some task group updates that is conversational. So hopefully we can continue. I don't know the exact rules, but.
Thank you. This is, at this point, we're not making decisions. These or as you say, conversational reports. To the extent there are reports, can you lead us off, TJ, with the biomass report, if there is one?
Maybe we'll turn to Megan or Jane, who've been attending the meetings, and to give that report. I've been getting updates from some folks, so I could probably wing it, but if somebody was attending the meeting that wants to chime in, might be better.
I'm happy to defer to Jane, if that's okay with you, Jane.
I was trying to be quiet. I know I'm happy to. We had a meeting yesterday, and at that meeting, it was the first time we actually took the meeting to actually really start to sort of get a sense of what the task group has learned over the course of the last 4 to 6 months through all the presentations and conversations, and then what questions still exist. And then we started to poll the task group around broad sort of thesis statements, as well as next steps for the task group itself. And those are online at the, if you go to the link for the meeting yesterday, you'll see those poll results. I posted those this morning. So you'll be able to see sort of where the group is starting to fall around recommendations, specifically around biomass for electricity. I don't think that the group will draw conclusive recommendations around biomass beyond electricity plants. And so the next steps now are the group is not meeting next Wednesday, but rather that a smaller group of the task group is meeting to review a write-up that Pat Field from CBI and myself have put together, sort of summarizing what we've heard from the task group to actually put forward recommendations to the council. They're also attempting to schedule, Chase Whiting and Pat Field are attempting to schedule an additional meeting next week to actually hear from one more presenter, Dr. Sternum from MIT, as well as to have an extended public comment period. But I think they're running into a challenge of actually finding a date and time for that. So the task group will come together one more time on Wednesday, October 12th, in an effort to put forward what we're calling not recommendations, but an interim report, I think is where we're landing for the council meeting on the 17th. And then the council will really need to sort of determine if this is a priority for resources to continue to go to and what that looks like around scope. So I think the council is going to have to really be prepared, because I think there's very mixed consensus around sort of next steps and recommendations, ranging from like all of biomass conversation to continuing in a limited scope to facilitate public engagement, to all sorts of different opportunities. So we'll see where we get to, but the hope is to really be able to pull something together and present on the 17th to the council meeting.
TJ, I need to answer the door. I'll be right back. Right.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jane, for that summary. I think I've found it. Hopefully the council can also think about, if it is to go forward, kind of the structure of that committee, if it is really a subcommittee on its own, or where it should kind of the process of the recommendations from that committee. Because I think that's been a little confusing and may have added to the confusion of that task group and its direction, honestly. So.
Yeah, and that's really important just for everybody to pick up on what TJ is really saying there, is that because of the time invested into the learning and the writing, and there isn't time to bring the recommendations or report back up through the respective subcommittees before it goes to the council, largely because it's 3 different subcommittees that are represented there. So the work is going straight to the council, and I do think that's awkward and not consistent with policy or process, I should say, in the past for how the council has worked. So I think that is something to highlight at the council meeting and consider how that should function going forward.
TJ, you're muted.
Great. Yeah, thank you. And thanks, Jane. So Joey, do you want to talk about the transportation work group at all?
Sure. I mean, I can say that, we presented the memo, which I dropped in the chat here at the last climate council meeting. It's, pretty high level, and at the same time would say that generally it seemed like people were supportive of the direction that it articulated. And I can't recall, Jane, if you'd ever shared the sort of the polling that came out, the real-time polling, but I think just Michelle Boomhauer raised concerns, and I haven't heard any more specifics from her on what those are. But Andrea, you were going to try and loop in with her and see if we could just address those concerns.
Yeah, it was Michelle and Kristen.
Okay.
I can't
Secretary
recall, there
Fonzo
was
too.
one more, and June kind of was like, don't know enough yet or something. Haven't processed it enough or something like that.
Jane, you were gonna. Okay, go ahead.
My understanding is that Kristen, the secretaries are discussing this and plan to provide something back. I don't know the timeline for that, but I anticipate fairly soon.
Yeah, my hope,
Ideally by Monday, when our task group meeting meets.
I don't know if it'll be Monday, but
I doubt that.
Okay, it's just been a couple of weeks.
I do expect there to be comments from the administration on the memo.
Yeah.
So will that come up then? what's the feedback loop? When you say, Jane, there's going to, or Andrea, there's going to be comments from the administration, does that come through this committee and the task group? Is it just to the Climate Council? How will that work? Do you know?
I don't know, Jane, do you have a proposal for that?
Have a proposal. Well, at the last transportation task group meeting, so I know that Joey and Jared, you all were concerned about and trying to address counselors who had raised concerns in the chat, and tried to do some homework to further advance the memo so that when it went back to the council, likely in November, those concerns would either have been identified and immediately fixed in the memo, or if not, at least you went into the council meeting eyes wide open to what the expected challenges would be to overcome with the council, to hopefully vote to adopt the memo in some way. As an, I still can't quite see it as an addendum to the climate action plan, but something. I get that. I think that's what we're striving for, and so I know that Joey and Jared asked Andrea and I specifically to work with Secretary Moore and Secretary Flynn as voting members to sort of try to figure out where they were on this and what their specific concerns were. And I know in my conversations with Julie that she was going to reach out to June. And also she's been talking to Secretary Clauser and Commissioner Tierney. I should give her respect to Commissioner Tierney. And so ultimately, my understanding would be that anything from the task group would then come back up through this subcommittee to then go to the council in November. So we have, 6 weeks of sort of work to do ahead of us to try to get to a memo that has broad support by the council.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful, I think, on the process to know what to expect. And we have an October 20th cross-sector meeting, so we'll expect that to be on the agenda. Hopefully it can come by then. Just really quickly, the thermal group, I think Rich kind of already gave the update in terms of the RFP is posted as of yesterday, I think. The comment that I wanted to provide on what you had said earlier is just consideration for how should I phrase this? Consideration for the long game to build the trust and confidence in the process necessary to actually make progress. And so I think there's this balance of getting results in January so the legislature can act, but well, what is the quality of those results and what is the really meaning of them, and how were folks able to participate in that? I don't know what the right answer is. Honestly, I can see arguments in both directions if I'm just kind of being TJ here and impartial, but it's there's some of me that says, for 40 years we should have been acting yesterday on climate, and we've taken actions in that guise and kind of been pushing really hard, and and we really haven't taken the action. And so if we have a little bit longer game, not like years and years, but a year, not even a year. And I'm not even trying to say that we shouldn't have results by March or whatever. We need to have good, solid results whenever we can. But I just don't want to rush things with bad information, and that creates a lack of trust that really undermines the process. And I just want to throw that out there as a consideration, and recognizing that we do need to move with urgency as well. So just the thought. Joey?
I mean, I totally agree that we need to move with urgency. I think the concern that I kind of heard as an undercurrent in what Rich was saying that I share is just, it frankly feels like we're back to the drawing board, when if we would have started the Climate Council with a broad-based RFP looking at what should we do in the thermal sector, which we have done in Vermont a little bit, we would be in a different place in service of our legal obligations and the clock that is ticking when it comes to climate. So my concern is that, and I think that we had raised a concern that the RFP is so broad, instead of centering an analysis around the clean heat standard and comparing other strategies in comparison to a clean heat standard, it's now sort of opening a very wide analysis, which I fundamentally agree and very much support. Getting as much information with the costs, benefits, economic impacts, et cetera, outlined. I just have concerns about sort of a seemingly circular process to get those answers. So, and, it's similar dynamic in the transportation space. And unfortunately, TCIP was an important, well, examined, as imperfect as that process was, so I think we're similarly in a space in the transportation sector. So anyway, I think that's what I heard as an undercurrent to Rich's concern, or at least something that I would have concern about. But clearly we want the answers. In the meantime, waiting for those answers, we're stuck with the status quo, which is, in my opinion, terrible.
You're still on mute. Yeah, TJ.
You'd think I would have figured this out by now, 2.5 years later, but I was saying very fair and good points, Joey. Thank you. I realize that it's largely my fault that there's only 2 minutes left here in the last 20, but unless there's anything else, I feel like we should open it up for public comment. I will be late to my next meeting if there is any to kind of continue on here. Jane, I don't think you're a member of the public. I don't think you
Right.
can.
So let's just see if there are public comments. And now to Jane.
Yeah, I know Joey and Rich and others have all heard this from me and TJ and others, but just for public record and conversation about the RFP, I do just want to note that in order to analyze the clean heat standard, you have to have other policies to analyze it against. That is sort of the ground reason for, like, the main reason for, like, that initial qualitative analysis to help us build the scenarios. And in response to sort of getting us to the quantitative analysis that we all want to further drive the conversation of a buildings and thermal policy, sooner than sort of spinning our wheels and reviewing old information over and over again. Brian Woods, who has been very attentive to making edits and changes on this RFP on everyone's behalf, really did try to drive sort of the expectations around how quick the first task would be done and how quickly we would move to that analysis, so that we're not repeating history, but really driving new understanding and new work. So I do want to say that we're very much on board to sort of get through that quickly, build the scenarios, and start to really understand what is the best foot forward, which may very well be the policy that we were looking at last legislative session. But I think that baseline analysis and having it all in one place will be really helpful to further that conversation.
Jane, thanks very much. And that is my understanding. That's really what I was trying to address earlier. So thanks for the clarification. Anything further for the committee? All right, I want to thank those of you who showed up and stuck through this committee meeting, and greatly appreciate it. Anything further from anybody? All right, we're adjourned. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.